Well, thank you, Jen, and to everyone, welcome to our discussion today. And we're going to be talking about the legal obligations of boards with respect to reserves. And when hearing about legal obligations, most people think about state law, and that is indeed part of it. But what we're going to talk about today is much more than state law. In fact, we'll touch very little on the checkerboard of various state laws across the country addressing reserves. And that's because state laws aren't the things that primarily drive reserve planning or reserve funding. By the end of today's webinar, I believe you'll learn that reserve funding is foundational to this entire concept of community association living and the community association structure of home ownership. So what I'm going to show you now is the outline of the conversation we plan to have today, and that's actually exactly what I mean. Typically in webinars, our program follows a series of slides that take us step by step through the program. But today, in preparing for this webinar, Adrian and I thought that, the conversation we were having was such free-flowing and informative, and it was just right on pace. We're following the issues that we thought that we would just plain have a conversation in front of you. So, Adrian, welcome to the program today.
Thank you, Robert.
Well, let's at least start out by following the agenda, and let's talk about a board's fundamental responsibility. So, if state law is not the authority, then who or what is the authority?
Well, your governing documents, so it's going to be, by state, the impact of the state laws, as you said, varies. In California, we have a pretty large body of law, and they keep adding to it every year. But your governing documents have significant impact on board responsibilities, both in the CC&Rs and your bylaws. But when it comes to reserves, the greater impact has recently been Fannie Mae and insurance carriers. And that's because of the collapse of Champlain Towers. That's the 12-story building in Surfside, Florida, that collapsed in, 2001 or 2021, I think.
2021,
And in fact,
5 years ago tomorrow.
Right, tomorrow. And it killed 98 people, and it sent shockwaves throughout the nation, throughout our industry. And Fannie Mae, in particular, was very interested in the collapse because they handle the secondary mortgage market, meaning that banks, lenders, they will loan for an owner to buy a condo. And then they turn around, take that loan, and sell it to Fannie Mae. And so Fannie Mae then gives them money for that loan so that the bank can now have more money to loan for people to buy more condos or homes or, residences of some kind. But the condo market became the primary focus because of the collapse of the towers. And so Fannie Mae is now holding these loans, and the people that would have been paying on those loans are now dead. So what is that going to have impact throughout the rest of the condo market across the nation? And that is, are the people who are paying on those loans going to be able to pay on those loans if there's a similar situation as with Champlain Towers in these condo associations? So they became very interested in what's the condition of these properties. Are they properly funding reserves? Have they even done reserve studies? Are they maintaining their properties? And so they created a lender questionnaire, which they then passed out to lenders throughout the nation, which lenders are now using as a review on whether to make loans in condo associations. That became a huge driver in what's happening with the whole reserves and maintenance, common area maintenance of markets. In fact, I think, Robert, they just made some changes. They did some upgrades. What did they do with the requirements into reserve funding?
In March of 2026, Fannie and Freddie's requirements apply to condos, not to HOAs and associations that don't maintain the residential structures. But for associations that maintain the residential structures, the condos, the co-ops, they raised the minimum standard from 10% of total budget up to 15%. And that didn't sound like a big deal And it should not be a big deal because most associations, most condo associations, need to fund reserves 15 to 45% of their entire budget. So someone raising the standard from 10 to 15% shouldn't make much difference. But what it does, I see it a lot like the seatbelt law. A long time ago, there used to be just lap belts. Adrian, you remember that?
Oh,
And then
yeah.
it went to the over the shoulder belt. And for people who are driving safely, it means no difference. You're a little better protected. And it's the same thing here. The minimum standard for Fannie and Freddie went from 10% to 15%. It's like getting the shoulder belt across. It's a little bit better. But again, it's still up to you to drive safely. It's still up to you to fund your reserves appropriately for your association. And for the people that are confused, someone told me once how it works, and they compared lending to like your corner gas station. The corner gas station fundamentally doesn't drill for oil. They're just continually reselling the oil that they get. And the lender that you deal with, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, ABC loans, they just sell the loan to you. And then, was it 70% of the time? They push it off to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. That's the
Right.
consumer that they're sending it to. So they
Right.
get fresh cash that they can then be the agent and
Reloan again.
lend to the consumer.
Exactly.
So Fannie and Freddie are foundational to the entire mortgage industry in this country. They are the biggest consumer of laws. And my understanding is that they're not primarily concerned about people dying, although, like you said, that's 98 people that aren't paying their mortgage. They're concerned about big special assessments. They're concerned about the big costs, and they want associations to not get behind.
And the reason why they're concerned about the big special assessments is it may drive some people out of their condos. They may default. So again, they're concerned about are those borrowers going to be able to pay back the loans? And that's why the reserves became a big issue, has become very important to them. And also to the insurance industry. They're looking at risk, and they're looking at what kind of risk are they facing because of lack of maintenance of the common areas. So both Fannie and Freddie, which I think are the bigger drivers right now, but you've got the insurance carriers bringing up the rear. But I interrupted you. You were going to say
No,
some more on Fannie and Freddie?
no, that was the same. And I like you going down. And this is why we're not doing a PowerPoint, because we want to follow the conversation.
Right.
I like you talking about the insurance industry because it's the same thing. They got burned on the big Champlain Tower South collapse, and they are still. I hear about so many very expensive payouts and verdicts, and
Yeah.
that's why insurance premiums are going up. And we want our listeners to know that they have agency. If they can show their insurance company that they are taking care of business and not just letting things deteriorate to the point that they will break and cause a problem, then you can get a more favorable premium. And in a time when insurance premiums are going high, we want to arm you, our audience, with everything you can to minimize your insurance premiums. So be friendly, take care of your property, do the right things. And that's why the insurance companies are looking on about reserve funding also.
Yeah, the payout on that the collapse of that the 12-story tower was $1.2 billion in settlement. So yes, they have an interest. The insurance industry has been taking huge hits, from fires and floods and tornadoes and all that, but they also are now looking at, what kind of risk do they face from these aging infrastructures? Because the condo industry, which really kicked off in the 60s, and then they started building a lot of them in the 70s and 80s, and they've been continuing to build them ever since, is aging. And components that weren't looked at before in reserve studies are now being looked at. I think they updated the reserve requirements. Can you tell us a little bit what they're looking at now?
Sure. The National Reserve Safe Standards were updated in 2023, again, after the Champlain Tower South collapse, and they broadened the scope of the test for what applies for reserve funding. It was a tighter 4-part test, and they broadened it to a 3-part test to allow us to help the association fund those one-time projects, to fund the big repairs, those kinds of things through reserves. It used to be more specific to just cyclical projects, but now you can use the reserves, and I believe wonderfully so. We want the board members and the homeowners to be able to fund things effectively, to find the lowest costs, and that has to do with just taking care of the property.
Which is a good point in that reserves are there to be spent. So you don't put the money into reserves and then sit on it forever. You have to actually do the spending to make the repairs, make the replacements, to take care of the roofs, to take care of the plumbing system, to do what needs to be done so that you don't have catastrophic failures in your systems, which result in emergency special assessments.
We wanted to broaden the scope of what can be funded through reserves. So when board members need to take care of the building, they can grab their hands into reserves and get it done. And we like that. And then I'm looking at my map across the country here. And another reason why we're not focusing on state laws today is because as the states on my map are different colors, the laws are different colors. But I'm looking at, because we're talking about Florida, the difference between something that is in northern Florida, like Jacksonville, or across the border in Georgia, or a little bit more up the East Coast, like Hilton Head or Myrtle Beach, things like that. Mother Nature and Father Time, they don't care about state borders.
Yeah, and time and weather, I mean, just it can take a brutal toll. And depending on where in the country, if it's on the coast or if it's in the desert, it will have a different impact. But this is where reserve studies really are important in helping boards of directors to know what they need to fund, when things are going, what the lifespan of these components are, how much money they need in order to replace them or repair them when the time comes.
I think we laid a pretty good foundation there. Let's move on and let's talk now about the board members. So legal documents define common areas and private space and how the association is run. You alluded to that when you're talking about responsibility. And what we appreciate is, in general, homeowners are responsible for their own home, their private space, but it's the board that's responsible, fundamentally responsible for how the corporation is run and sustained. Is that a pretty good blanket statement, Adrian?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, board members become fiduciaries as soon as they're elected or appointed to the board. So as homeowners, they don't have any particular, higher standards that they have to meet. They can vote for their own self-interests. And frequently they do. If you put a vote of special assessment, they will more often than not vote no.
Especially when it has to do with a repair on the next building, not their building.
Of course. Yeah, and this is where board members, they are required, they become fiduciaries, so they're held to a higher standard. And they have to put the interests of the association ahead of their own interests. So they may not want to impose a special assessment. They may not want to pay a special assessment, but it's in the best interest of the community to repair the elevators, to replace the roof, to do whatever needs to be done, especially if there's safety issues. And so that may require the imposition of a special assessment, and it may be an emergency one. And I have associations right now that are dealing with emergency special assessments. And so boards are required as fiduciaries to, one of their fiduciary duties is a duty of care, a duty of, to investigate, a duty of due diligence. And that's where a reserve study comes in, because as part of their due diligence, finding out what are the components in their buildings, what's the useful remaining life of those components, what's it going to cost to replace them. And so reserve studies, in fact, I don't know, are reserve studies required in every state?
No, only about half the states.
That's a mistake by the other half. They need to get on board and require it.
Yeah, but then again, that's a little bit of what we're talking about today. There's a checkerboard of, is a reserve study required? Is reserve funding required? Is a reserve disclosure required? How often does your state say it needs to be done? Again, that's trivia on the side. What we want to talk about today is like you let out with, it's fundamental responsibility
right?
of the community
So
association
even if there
industry.
isn't a state law, right? Yeah, and even in California, which requires a funding or reserve studies, it doesn't actually have a funding level requirement. And it isn't until Fannie Mae started coming out with their requirements that you have it going across the entire nation. They're driving a lot of this. So associations that aren't required by law to have reserve studies should do them anyway. They need to find out,
Yeah.
they need to, it's part of their due diligence, find out
Well,
what's there and what needs to be done.
let's talk about becoming a board member a little bit more because you're a homeowner. You buy Unit 13. It's across from the park. It's a short commute to where you're working. If you do go back to the office, but you like it. It's a good school district. You like it. But when you raise your hand and all of a sudden you become a board member, that's kind of a night and day difference now, right?
Oh, yeah.
That's what you're talking about.
Right. And that's where your focus has to be on what is, taking care of the community as a whole. And this is where, in the primary fund, I mean, the whole reason associations are created is to deal with common areas because you've got ownership in common by everybody, but who's going to take care of those common areas? It's not going to be the city, it's not the county, it's not the state, it's the association. So the association is run by a board. So the board of directors now has to take charge of that. They have to create a budget. They have to look at, the common areas, define them, find out what they need to do and take care of that business. Problem is too many boards defer because they don't want to raise the dues on their neighbors. And unfortunately, I think that's what happened with Champlain Towers. They deferred and deferred for 40 years. They deferred and it
Right.
caught up with them.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the board a little bit more because you got, let's just say in this hypothetical, 5 board members. And
Right.
quite often they look around and they say, who's good with numbers? Okay, you be the treasurer.
Right.
And you look at what a board member's strength is or affinity. And there's going to be some that say, okay, you're the life of the party. You manage the 4th of July celebration, the Labor Day celebration. You manage social things, whatever it is. And so sometimes you perhaps are good at something, but the majority of the time, you're not an expert and you don't
Right.
know. And why did the flowers in the front die? Well, you got to talk to your landscaper about that. And oh, yeah, you have so much sun there that the type of flowers that you asked us to plant, they will not last more than 2 weeks, whatever it is. So fundamentally, you need to go to your painter, your roofer, your landscaper, your attorney, your manager, your insurance agent. As a board member, I want to encourage the boards, Adrian, is it right, to always be going to your experts, going to the people
Right.
who can tell you how to do it and how to do it right.
Yeah. And theoretically, boards could do their own reserve studies, but I think that's a terrible idea. Because the potential liability they incur because they're doing something where they miss major components.
Yeah.
And whereas a independent third party reserve company, well, no, they'll have the templates that they built over the years. They know what to look for. They know what the components are, what the lifespans are, what the different materials are that go into them, whether it's a thin walled copper or the thicker walled copper piping, and what is the lifespan of each. So I encourage boards to use an independent reserve company in order to develop those studies.
Yeah. Well, just because you can doesn't mean you should. And
Right.
I've spent enough time with you to know that if you or I were to paint a wood fence, we could probably paint a wood fence. But boy, Adrian, I think it would look like you and I painted a fence. And the same with the ironwork around the pool. We could, but I don't think that would be in the best interest of the association.
Right.
And isn't that kind of the key thing that we're talking about?
Right.
We could
and
go down to Home Depot and get some paint and a few brushes and
yeah. Well, I think in addition to like reserve studies, the thing that we're running into now is can you use GPT in order to get legal advice? You could, but it's a horrible idea. So again, these are 2 critical areas, talking to legal counsel and doing a proper reserve study and then funding it. So, and that's the key there. They got to fund it. Once they get the study, it doesn't do any good if they don't put any money in.
yeah. Well, that's what you're talking about is the courage that it takes, not only the impetus, the desire to find out what are we up against, what kind of flowers should we plant, how much is it going to cost to have the guy who painted our buildings last year now paint the ironwork around the pool. There's lots of times you need to ask for questions, but you also need to then execute, to hire someone to paint that ironwork, hire someone to do something, spend the money. And the same with reserves. The roof is getting older every month, and it's tick-tock. You've got maybe 20 years worth of months, 240 months, and it's almost like a NASCAR race. The Mother Nature and Father Time are circling the track, and if you're in pit lane thinking about, well, what should we do? Mother
You're
Nature
gonna
and
lose
Father
that
Time,
race. Right.
oh, you're going to lose that race. And so
Right.
you got to put up the funding. Well, is that may be where it's time for us to shift now to the third section here, and we'll go to the response. Now that everyone knows the responsibility is driven by these bigger powers, national powers, the association is run by the board of directors who speak on behalf of, and Adrian, you use that keyword fiduciary. The question is, well, we've been suggesting some responses, but now what do they actually do?
Well, they've got to. I think we pretty much touched on the necessity of actually getting a study done, and then funding it. And if they don't fund it, then they're going to be looking at several things are going to happen. One is that they're going to be somewhere down the road looking at large special assessments, and the longer they defer the repairs, the more expensive they become. And not only that, but the improper funding and deferred maintenance will drive down property values. So property values that they depend on, people may be retiring, or people may be, it's their investment, and at some point they want to sell. Well, the market's going to drive down values if there's a lot of deferred maintenance and there's underfunded reserves. So it's important for boards, even though it may be painful and people are unhappy that you're raising the dues and you're putting in more money into reserves, it's actually better for everybody in the long run. So that's one of their responsibilities, and that's something that they need to step up and do as directors.
Yeah, and that's courage. And you said it in the last section, I believe, that it's the board member's responsibility to take care of the common areas. Someone's got to, and it's their job.
It is,
It's not like
absolutely.
they can delegate to anyone else. And you talked about the problems. We talked special assessments are a problem because, well, insurance companies don't like deferred maintenance. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, they really don't like impending special assessments because they don't want homeowners to lose their ability to pay their mortgage. They're counting on 15 or 30 years worth of people being able to pay that bill. When I think about it, well, one thing I liked at the very beginning when we were looking at the poll was the variety of how boards are responding to their reserve requirements. Some are not very much, some are we're doing okay, and some like we are taking care of business. And I like that. And that's what we see in the industry, that some associations are spot on. At about a quarter of all associations in our measure, 26%, have a strong reserve fund. And we don't think of those because we never hear those associations. Champlain Towers South was one of those associations that had a very weak reserve fund. They were inviting problems. They were inviting deterioration. They just weren't putting up a good fight. We find that I got the numbers here, 34% of associations, so about 1/3 of associations are in the weak range. And they're the ones making the news. They're the ones who give condominiums and HOAs a bad reputation for special assessments, those kinds of things. But bottom line, you got to think of reserve funding as a usage fee. Just like when you rent a car or when you stay in a hotel, they charge you what it's going to take, not only for that one night, but they keep a bucket of money on the side for the oil change, the new tires, the carpet in the hallway, of the hotel, the elevator, and the hallway, you got to think of reserve funding as a usage fee, just what it takes to keep this place running.
The negative impact, which I haven't mentioned, is that Fannie Mae may blacklist the association, meaning that they will not allow any lending, or the lenders will not lend any monies in that association. And we represent associations here in California that are currently blacklisted.
Let me stop you right there. So
Yeah.
they were probably trying to save money by not funding reserves and taking care of the place. And now all of a
Right.
sudden, no offense, they got legal bills because now they got to
Oh
dig
yeah.
themselves out of a hole. And still, they need to fix the balconies and the roof and whatever they weren't
Right.
doing.
So they're looking at special assessments. They're looking at increased legal expenses. And they're looking at higher costs on making the repairs and replacements. So deferring does not really help them. It hurts them in the long run. They're better off just funding them as they go along and taking care of business than making repairs. And I've got an association right now that did an emergency special assessment because they had partial balcony collapse. And they're looking at all their balconies and they need to be repaired and replaced. And it required a significant, emergency special assessment. And of course, you've got homeowners who are trying to undermine the board, who are unhappy or upset. Same thing as happened in Champlain Towers. And that's why they never got anything done there. And then eventually the building collapsed. It's better off to take care of business, even though it may be painful, than to wait to get blacklisted, get hit with legal fees, higher costs on repairs, emergency special assessments. It's just not worth it.
When you defer it, the costs don't disappear.
No,
They just
the
back
increase.
up. They still need to be paid. They get higher with inflation. They get higher with scope creep. When instead of just replacing your roof, all of a sudden now, because of all the roof leaks, you got to replace the underlayment and the costs just go up. Same with painting. Instead of just painting the surface, now they got to do some carpentry repairs for all the dry rot. So yeah, it just gets expensive. In rough numbers, I said it earlier, typically associations need to set aside 15 to 45% of their total budget towards reserves.
Right.
So it is a big chunk. Owning and maintaining real estate is fundamentally expensive. I think that is one of those laws of the community association industry that states have nothing to do with. It's just fundamentally the cost of home ownership. So that's an issue. There's a lot of differences in, again, I keep looking at my map here, what states ask for or require. And it comes back to some real simple things that every year the costs of your reserve projects change, the condition of your reserve projects change, and the cash in your reserve changes. And that combination of things always moving means that when it's budget line item that big, it's appropriate for you to look at that regularly. And national best practice is for a with site visit update every third year. And that's a good recommendation. And it has nothing to do with state law. It's all fundamentally coming back to Mother Nature and Father Time. You got to see as opponents. And Adrian, you've got a lot of legal responsibilities to execute and be courageous.
Yeah, well, we push hard on boards, especially when it comes to safety issues. And a lot of these components that they start failing, well, especially water intrusion, internal pipes, roofs, windows, because they lead to mold. And mold then turns into litigation with personal injury claims, which gets very expensive. And insurance premiums go up, or insurance gets canceled. And so, going back to the poll that Jen did, was it 34% said they were properly funded? Is that typical across the nation? Has that been your experience?
We don't only have a good view on that because the only clients we touch are the ones asking for help and wanting professional assistance.
Right.
So we see that about a quarter of the associations across the country are well funded. I liked seeing that 30-some% number because it meant that some are approaching well funded, which I really like. It just means that since the expenses are what they are, if you're paying it on a monthly basis, it's like a usage fee. Special assessment fears go away.
Okay, so if, let's say, half or so of the nation's condos are not properly funded, I expect we're going to see more blacklisting.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, we're going to see more condo associations, you know, suffering the painful situation of not being able now to get conventional lending. And maybe all cash purchases, all that, but the conventional lending is not going to be available, which is going to drive down property values. So their market is going to drive way down. And again, it just goes to what we've been saying. They really need to pay attention um, as boards to their responsibility to take care of the common areas. That means getting a reserve study and funding it.
Yeah, because those costs don't go away if they're ignored. So we're going to come to the conclusion section of our program here today. And we wanted to make it clear that what we have here is multi-million-dollar nonprofit entities. It's the entire community association industry. They're run by untrained volunteers, well-intended volunteer board of directors. And, what could go wrong? And what could go wrong is we've talked about running out of money. And when you run out of money, then there's liability because the board is the fiduciary. They are caring for the assets on behalf of all the homeowners. We want the associations that we touch to be well maintained, to be smoothly operating, there's so many operational things, rules and regulations, consistent enforcement, consistent cash flow, few delinquencies, functioning committees, all those kinds of things. That's what we want. We don't want, and this is Adrian, picture from your website, we don't want associations focusing on low monthly assessments because Mother Nature and Father Time, they are undefeated. From the beginning of time, they win.
Low monthly assessments may be great if they're properly funding everything and taking care of business. But if you're doing it just for the purpose of keeping them low, this is what's going to happen. And then there are going to be lawsuits. I think we're going to see more lawsuits filed against boards of directors for breach of fiduciary duties. And you've got the business judgment rule that will protect them against individual personal liability, but that requires that their decisions be in good faith in the best interest of the association and after their due diligence, their own inquiry. And this is where the reserve study comes in. That's part of their due diligence. And if they're not doing that, they may find that they may be facing some personal liability.
Let me ask you, what if a board member is saying, but my homeowners can't afford it?
Yeah, well, I actually had an association that did that, where I was called in to serve as an expert witness in the lawsuit that followed because the board, for years and years and years, they refused to raise dues. They deferred, and they didn't put any money into reserves. And then finally, a huge rainstorm hit, massive water damage to units throughout the complex, lawsuits erupted, and the people they were trying to protect, which were on fixed incomes, which in fact, had they been doing regular, increases, those on fixed income could have said, okay, I can see where this is going. I need to look around and see if I can find something that I can afford. Well, what happened was when the lawsuits hit, huge special assessments, legal fees, people walked away from their units. They couldn't afford it. And so all those people on fixed income that they're trying to protect suddenly lost their investments. They lost their homes.
Right.
So it's really in their best interest to properly fund, to raise dues, to take care of business, because that's their job.
Yeah. Let me say it again in my words. The board's job is to manage the association, not the personal finances of someone else. Right. And if they're focusing on the association, then Mrs. Johnson in Unit 14 can say, I've enjoyed living on the beach in Santa Monica in our little condo, but it's time for me to move in with my grandkids because it's too expensive. And she can do that on her terms, getting top dollar for the sale of her unit rather than, the balcony that she couldn't use the last 2 years. And now there's a big $27,000 special assessment and she's just got to walk away. That's not kind. That's not loving your neighbor. Okay, Adrian, this is all you. You want to say a few words?
Yeah, our website, which is available free for anybody that wants to use it, and a ton of information on there. We've got more information than any other website in the country. dealing with associations. And we just added artificial intelligence to it, which we're getting ready to launch here shortly. And also, we're going to be switching over to adding a feature that allows it to be converted to any language of your choosing. So if you only speak Spanish and you only read Spanish or Chinese or whatever it is, it will convert the entire website to that language for them.
That's very
So
cool.
that will be launched here shortly.
Yeah. Now, this is California law.
Yes.
Okay. From my point of view as a national provider, this is great principles, but when it gets down to state-specific stuff, if you're
Right.
not in California, you should be touching another law firm.
Right.
But
Checking to
general
see what your
principles,
state requires.
yeah.
And
But general
frankly,
principles,
if they follow California law, which is probably some of the top laws in the nation, they're going to be in good shape. But really, they need to be checking their own state laws.
yeah, I like that. And then we're here at Association Reserves. We're reservestudy.com. This program, as Jen said earlier, is going to be recorded. You'll be able to find it on reservestudy.com or on YouTube. We have a book about reserves studies and reserve funding that's available on Amazon. We have a weekly podcast for board members. So if you like this type of content and you're someone who wants to be encouraged and equipped, we have a 30-minute podcast, comes out once a week. You can find it on all major podcast platforms. It's called HOA Insights, Common Sense for Common Areas. And you can see more, again, at any major podcast platform, or you can go straight to our website, hoainsights.org. And with that, I'll turn the microphone over to Jen, who will coordinate a little bit of Q&A time.